Hey crew, it's Pitt and I'm back with some more esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Mysterium Coniunctionis. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, the link for my book where I teach you to do magic and live responsibly, and the link for getting in contact with me directly so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and jump into Part 1, Chapter 3, The Personification of the Opposites. We will do the introduction and the sun today. Tomorrow will be the moon and the rest of the chapter. There's like 40 pages in this one, so we will probably blast through it fairly quickly. I do not know. Chapter 3, The Personification of the Opposites. 1, Introduction. The alchemist endeavors to unite the opposites culminate in the chemical marriage, the supreme act of union in which the work reaches its consummation. After the hostility of the four elements has been overcome, there still remains the last and most formidable opposition, which the alchemist expressed very aptly in the relationship between male and female. We are inclined to think of this primarily as the power of love, of passion, which drives the two opposite poles together, forgetting that such a vehement attraction is needed only when an equally strong resistance keeps them apart. Although enmity was put only between the serpent and the woman, Genesis 3:15 there, this curse nevertheless fell upon the relationship of the sexes in general. It is important to note that God cursed woman for doing something that she was not even instructed not to do. Eve was told, "Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." That wasn't put in by any, people wanting to stay in charge of women. That wasn't what happened there at all. And Adam was told, "Cursed is the ground for thy sake, but thou, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife." All right, so there's another verse in this book that will tell you that a wise man will listen to the counsel of his wife. Primal guilt lies between them, an uninterrupted and interrupted state of enmity, and this appears unreasonable only to our rational mind, but not to our psychic nature. Let's go ahead and do it. I'm beyond the point of not stepping on toes anymore. I know, right? I used to tiptoe around toes. I am not going to do that anymore. Genesis is a lie. Genesis is an out-and-out lie. There is so many problems with Genesis that I cannot even begin to start, but I'm going to try, right? In the beginning, God created the entirety of everything, and he is all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful, with the full dominion over the entirety of creation, right? And he builds this garden, and he puts a tree right in the middle of it, and then he creates man. But he doesn't give the man the ability to discern between good and evil. He gives him some instructions, but the man does not know that it is evil to disobey the instructions of God. Wow. Okay, so then he creates a woman, and he puts her in the garden, and he does not tell her not to eat of the apple. He only told the man, but the woman goes, and she is tempted, and she's the one that takes the fruit, right? She's the one that caused the change? Yeah, okay. And then God didn't know that they would eat from the apple. He had no clue. He put that there not considering even the possibility that they would. Right? It wasn't part of his plan that they would actually eat the apple and gain the knowledge and go out and experience things. That wasn't it, right? They had to sin first. It had to be sin. That's what caused it, because they didn't know the difference between good and evil, and therefore, absolutely, they can sin, right? That is just scratching the surface of the problems in Genesis. It continues throughout the entire book. There are so many problems, if you try to read it as a literal thing. I'm going to let you in on something that is not even contested, right? This is not even contested. There is no written record of Adam and Eve from Adam and Eve. There is not one from Enoch. There is not one from anything up until Moses. Up until Moses, we have zero record of anything. All of it is completely gone. There is nothing from the Jews at all prior to Moses. And there is no reason to believe that Moses existed. There are as many problems, if not more, in Exodus than there are in Genesis. So many problems that I can't even get into them because I don't have enough time. I did 161 hours of reading the Bible and finding these contradictions and pointing them out. People don't like it. People don't care for it. I understand that. You are in a control system. But you don't read your own source material. And if you do, you read it with the already predetermined outcome already there. Of course, all of this had to happen because Jesus had to come along and save your life. Except that is not a Old Testament concept at all. Except there is no prophecy of a virgin birth at all. Except there is no sacrifice for the remission of sin on an eternal level at all. These are problems, major problems with this book. And people taking this book for an authority is one of the major problems in our life. Our reason is often influenced far too much by the purely physical considerations, so that the union of the sexes seems to it the only sensible thing, and the urge for union the most sensible instinct of all. Wait. This appears unreasonable only to our rational mind and not to our psychic nature. Our reason is often influenced too much by purely physical considerations, so that the union of the sexes seems to it the only sensible thing, and the urge for union the most sensible instinct of all. So that is talking about partnership, possibly about sexual relations, right? The urge for union. But that's not just sexual, right? The concourse between two souls is much preferable to sexual union. And so that would be coming into accordance with your spouse. There's troubles there. But if we conceive of nature in the higher sense as the totality of all phenomena, then the physical is only one of her aspects. The other is pneumatic or spiritual. The first has always been regarded as feminine. The second is masculine. The goal of the one is union. The goal of the other is discrimination. Because it overvalues the physical, our contemporary reason lacks spiritual orientation. That is, pneuma. The alchemists seem to have had an inkling of this, for how otherwise could they have come upon that strange myth of the country of the king of the sea, where only like pairs with like, and the land is unfruitful? I am unfamiliar with that myth. Well, look, there is a footnote. I almost missed that. Visio Aristotle. We have until 4. All right. It was obviously a realm of innocent friendship, a kind of paradise or golden age, to which the philosophers, the representatives of the physical, felt obliged to put an end with their good advice. Where only like pairs with like and the land is unfruitful. That is weird, right? So, it is obviously a realm of innocent friendship. That is not what is intimated there, right? It's not, right? Like pairs with like is not talking about friendship. That is talking about a sexual partnership, a commitment type situation, not just friends, right? The representatives of the physical felt obliged to put an end with their good advice. But what happened was not by any means a natural union of the sexes. On the contrary, it was a royal incest, a sinful deed that immediately led to imprisonment and death, and only afterwards restored the fertility of the country. As a parable, the myth is certainly ambiguous, like alchemy in general. It can be understood spiritually as well as physically. Tam moralis quam chemica. Now, without the knowledge of the myth, and I'm not going to go and look it up, I don't have a whole lot to add to this, right? I don't. The physical goal of alchemy was gold. The physical goal of alchemy was gold. The panacea, the elixir of life. The spiritual one was the rebirth of the spiritual light from the darkness of physis. Healing, self-knowledge, and the deliverance of the pneumatic body from the corruption of the flesh. Now, you will not overcome the corruption of the flesh while you are incarnated within the flesh. The flesh will die. You will never find the eternal stone that will turn the elixir that will make you live forever on the mortal coil. Your soul is already eternal. It has nothing to do with what you do here, one way or the other. That lake of fire, it is not in the Old Testament at all. Dismiss it. No foundations. And so, healing self-knowledge, that is something that I have, but I do not claim to be free from the corruption of the flesh. I have healed myself in 4 different ways using the electromagnetic forces of creation. That is the Holy Spirit at the will of God. I do not deny that at all, right? He showed me how to do it. But I do not even try to say that I am not going to age, I am not going to die, that I cannot get sick. Those are all still possibilities in my life, even though I have already produced the fruit that so many have sought. The pursuit of extending your life here is a spiritual problem, right? Not that you should run into the arms of death, but it shouldn't be something that you necessarily flee from, right? Don't go and rush into it, but when it comes, it is not a bad thing. A subtle feature of the Visio Aristotle is that the very one who is mediating a pairing of the sexes is king of the land of innocence. Thus, the Rex Marinus says, "Truly I have a son and a daughter, and therefore I am king over my subjects, because they possess nothing of these things. Yet I have borne a son and a daughter in my brain." Hence, the king is a potential traitor to the paradisial state of innocence, because he can generate in his head, and he is king precisely because he is capable of this sin against the previous state of innocence. Since he can be different from them, he is more than any of his subjects, and therefore rightly, their king. Although from the physical standpoint, he is counted a bad ruler. Footnote 4. The philosophers say to him, "Lord, king you may be, but you rule and govern badly." Here again we see the contrast between alchemy and the prevailing Christian ideal of attempting to restore the original state of innocence by monasticism, and later by celibacy of the priesthood. See, that is stupid, right? God created you male and female in a pairing. He said, "Go forth, be fruitful and multiply." And in your pride, you have said that means do not have sex. He said, "Go out and be generous to people, but also go out and be a steward of the land. Subdue it." But then you have to say, give away all that you have. Go, get rid of everything. The wanting of multiple possessions is a sin that you must purge yourself from. No, you are meant to have things. You are not meant to give away anything. And anybody that is telling you that you should give away everything is telling you exactly the wrong thing. Now, I understand the spirit in which Christ relayed his message. He wasn't really even meaning that, right? He was not telling the guy, "Hey, get rid of everything," for spiritual enlightenment. He was saying, you cling to your things too much. That's what he was saying. He didn't really mean for the guy to get rid of everything. He meant you have too much desire for the worldly things. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have any desire. And him saying, give away everything, is wrong, right? It is directly oppositional to the will of God as expressed in the same book. Right? God specifically told you, go out, be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth and be stewards thereof. You are not a steward if you are not taking possession. Or at least responsibility. The conflict between worldliness and spirituality, latent in the love myth of mother and son, was elevated by Christianity to the mystic marriage of sponsors, Christ, and sponsa, church, whereas the alchemists transposed it to the physical plane as the conjunctio of Sol and Luna. The Christian solution to the conflict is purely pneumatic, the physical relations of the sexes being turned into an allegory, or quite illegitimately into a sin that perpetuates and even intensifies the original one in the garden. Right? You're not meant to have sex. You should not have a bride. Like, how can you even listen to that? It is better for a man not to be married. You know what that's about? It's because it is hard to come into accordance with someone else. And if you are going to walk your true, authentic path, you can't really care about what other people are thinking. And if you have someone else in your life, then you have a tendency to give into that a little bit. But, right, it is still better to have a partner. It is still better to grow and to love and to give and to be fruitful and multiply. And there was no sin involved with sex. That was not the sin in the garden. I don't know who got that idea from where, but that was not it. What was the sin in the garden? Eating from the fruit of the tree of what? The knowledge of good and evil, the ability to discern this from that, to understand good from evil. That is what the sin was. The ability to understand that you could even sin was a sin. And it had nothing to do with sex. Yes, they got ashamed of their nakedness. That's an argument too. Alchemy, on the other hand, exalted the most heinous transgression of the law, namely incest, into a symbol of the union of opposites, hoping in this way to bring back the golden age. That was equally stupid. There is nothing good about incestuous relationships. There has never been anything good about an incestuous relationship. There will never be anything good about an incestuous relationship. If you are involved in an incestuous relationship, you are bad at genetics. It is that simple. You will probably have a deformity in your progeny. You shouldn't mate with anyone close to you. The idea that the entirety of the cosmos came from a mother and a son having sex, that is wild to me. I do not comport with that at all. That is a personification of the concepts that I do not agree with, in the slightest bit. In this exact same way that I maintain that Logos was never a person, the universe did not come from a sexual union between a father or mother and a son. That did not happen. It is not a thing, and the allegory is a shitty one. It should not be used. I'm on a thing today. For both trends, the solution lay in extrapolating the union of the sexes into another medium. The one projected it into the spirit, the other into matter, but neither of them located the problem in the first place where it arose, the soul of man. No doubt, it would be tempting to assume that it was more convenient to shift such a supremely difficult question onto another plane and then represent it as having been solved. But this explanation is too facile and is psychologically false because it supposes that the problem was asked consciously, found to be painful, and consequently moved on to another plane. This stratagem accords with our modern way of thinking, but not with the spirit of the past, and there are no historical proofs of any such neurotic operation. Rather does all of the evidence suggest that the problem has always seemed to lie outside the psyche as known to us. Incest was the hieros gamos of the gods, the mystic prerogative of kings, a priestly right, etc., and it was wrong in every single one of those instances. In all these cases, we are dealing with an archetype of the collective unconscious, which, as consciousness increased, exerted an even greater influence on the conscious life. It certainly seems today as if the ecclesiastical allegories of the bridegroom and bride, not to mention the now completely obsolete alchemical conjunctio, had become so faded that one meets with incest only in criminology and the psychopathology of sex. Yeah, right? Freud's discovery of the Oedipus complex, a special instance of the incest problem in general, and its universal incidents have, however, reactivated this ancient problem, though mostly only for doctors interested in psychology. Freud was not correct in this. There is a certain element of Freud's understanding that is truthful, right? Your first love as a boy is your mother, right? But that's not necessarily sexual. I had no sexual desires for my mother. That is not a thing. And I am honest enough that I would admit it, right? I am honest enough that I would tell you I am not sexually attracted to my mother. My mother and my wife have no resemblance. They don't talk the same, they don't walk the same, they don't look the same. Hair color, eye color, skin tone, everything is different. There is no sexual attraction for me and my mother, but I had plenty of problems, right? I had plenty of problems relating to trauma, and some of them dealt with sexuality. That is true. I had some horrible things happen to me, but those things didn't have anything to do with my mother. The abandonment issues, okay, yeah, I probably got that from mama, right? There was the abuse issues, yeah, that came from her too, but sexual, no. But Freud goes back to that as much as he possibly can. It's probably because he actually did desire his mother. He was a sexual deviant, and he wanted everybody else to think that they were too. And so he came out with his theory, and they ran with it because it is victim mentality, and it is much easier to blame someone else than it is to take responsibility for yourself. You are making bad decisions, and it ain't got nothing to do with you wanting to have sex with your mother. It's got everything to do with you not giving due consideration to the items on the table, with you not paying attention to what the actual factual things are. That's where your problem is. It is not in you wanting to have sex with your mother, right? Now, that is not to exclude that there are some fucked up people, and those fucked up people, they do want to have sex with their mother. They do want to have sex with their sister or their father or their brother or their whatever. Those people are fucked up, but they are a small minority. It is not the overwhelming majority that Freud would have you believe. Most of our problems right here in the real world today is because of this very victim mentality that is intrinsic to Freud's viewpoint on psychology. It is intrinsic to the Bible itself. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament are predicated upon you have to give your sin responsibility to something else, and that is stupid. Back to the text. Even though laymen know very little about certain medical anomalies or have the wrong idea of them, this does not alter the facts any more than does the layman's ignorance of the actual percentages of case of tuberculosis or psychosis. Today, the medical man knows that the incest problem is practically universal, and that it immediately comes to the surface when the customary illusions are cleared away from the foreground. And maybe it's me. Maybe I am the exception, right? Maybe it is universal. Do you want to have sex with your mother? Is that what your problem is? Right? It's definitely not mine. Right? That I can stand on very well. I have deep dived my problems, and none of them were about having sex with my mother. Right? It is not universal in at least this one case. I have plenty of problems, and some of them were related to my mom, but it was not sexual at all. But mostly he knows only its pathological side and leaves it steeped in the odium of its name, without learning the lesson of history that the painful secret of the consulting room is merely the embryonic form of perennial problem, which, in the supra-personal sense of ecclesiastical allegory, and in the early phases of natural science, created a symbolism of the utmost importance. Generally, he sees only the materia vilis et in via iacta from the pathological side and has no idea of its spiritual implications. If he saw this, he could also perceive how the spirit that has disappeared returns in each of us in unseemly, indeed reprehensible guise, and in certain predisposed cases causes endless confusion and destruction in great things as in small. The psychopathological problem of incest is the aberrant, natural form of the union of opposites, a union which has either never been made conscious at all as a psychic task, or if it was conscious, has once more disappeared from view. Okay, the problem of incest as the natural form of the union of opposites is not true. It is not true. I don't know how to put it any more plainly than that. It is not true that it is the natural form of the union of opposites to have sex with your mother or your child or your father or your grandparents. That is not a natural form of the union of opposites. What I do over here, what I talk about in this book, that is the union of opposites. That is finding the balance between love and wrath, between lust and chastity, between greed and charity, between gluttony and denial, between pride and humility. That is the union of opposites. The balancing between the masculine and the feminine forces within yourself, that is the union of opposites. It has absolutely nothing to do with a son having sex with his mother. That has been a viewpoint. It has been expressed for thousands of years. But once again, I don't care how long something has been written down. If it is untrue, it is untrue. If it's been written for 5 minutes or 5,000 years. If it is true, it is true no matter how long it has been written. This is not true. The persons who enact the drama of this problem are man and woman. In alchemy, king and queen, sol and luna. King and queen does not imply father-son or mother-son, father-daughter. Right? That implies two full consenting adults that should not be related coming together into union. That would be a good representation. That has nothing to do with incest. In what follows, I shall give an account of the way in which alchemy describes the symbolic protagonist of the supreme opposition. Alright, now we get into the first meat of the chapter, right? There is like 40 pages in this chapter, 40 plus pages. So we're only going to get through soul and then we will call it a wrap for the day. 2. Soul. In alchemy, the sun signifies, first of all, gold, whose sign it shares. But just as the philosophical gold is not the common gold, footnote 5. Footnote 5 says, Senor de Chimica. So the sun is neither just the metallic gold, nor the heavenly orb. 6 and 7. 6 is, gold and silver in their metallic form are not the matter of our stone. Tractus Aureus. 7. Because gold is not subject to oxidation, soul is an arcanum described in the Concilium Conjugii as follows. A substance equal, permanent, fixed for the length of eternity. For soul is the root of incorruption. Verily, there is no other foundation of the art than the sun and its shadow. These are not necessarily referring to the same thing. Right? A substance equal, permanent, and fixed for its length of eternity can very well describe gold. That is an elemental metal. The primal state of it will not oxidize. You have to make alloys out of it if you wish it to be different than pure gold. That's not to say that you don't have to refine it to get it from this natural ore, but its natural state is a cube. Its natural formation is cubic, and it is homogeneous, right? It does tend to cluster together. That's why we find nuggets of gold in the way that we do, as opposed to iron normally does not come in a chunk. It is normally in a sand, or it's contained in a clay, and you have to refine it by smelting it. You can find gold in solid chunks of pure gold. It's harder to find iron that way. Not that you can't, it's just harder. Especially towards surface level stuff. But then soul is the root of incorruption. Okay, that is making the allegory between gold and the sun and both of them. But there is no other foundation of the art than the sun and its shadow. Does not refer to gold. Right? It can if you are trying to make that happen. But it is talking about the sun. Right? What happens if you occlude the light coming from the sun? You get a shadow. That intrinsic opposition of the opposites, much better explained than a mother and a son relationship, right? That balancing is part of the process. And so this is not necessarily talking about the same thing. Sometimes the sun is an active substance hidden in the gold and is extracted as the tinctura rubia, red tincture. Sometimes, as the heavenly body, it is the possessor of magically effective and transformative rays. That is the truth, right? The sun is the thing that powers us. I don't know that they even really understood that then. Photosynthesis is a fairly recent understanding. But it is true, right? The rays that come from the sun are the drivers for life on this planet. Without the sun, there is no life, right? It is magically effective and transformative. The light hitting the plants allows them to change the glucose into the proteins they need to grow. That is as simple as it gets, and it is way oversimplified. I understand that. But it is also true on another level. My personal belief is that evolution was kicked by a solar outburst of electromagnetic radiation, which caused genetic mutations in certain species all at the same time. Right? There is no genetic imperative for a person to develop from an ape outside of external influence. That external influence does not have to come from an alien. Right? It can be that the sun had an eruption. It does that all of the time. And that eruption hit Earth in a way that transformed life here. We have, here on this planet, as a species, created gold, the element being discussed, from other elements through electromagnetic bombardment. That is a thing that has happened with 3 elements. That is the same thing being talked about here, right? And again, there is no incestuous relationship involved in that whatsoever. As gold in a heavenly body, footnote 8, rupescissa, that is French, and it is all French. All right. As gold in a heavenly body, it contains an active sulfur of a red color, hot and dry. Footnote 9. Sulfur is even identical with fire. Know therefore that sulfur is fire, that it is soul. Soul is identical with sulfur. An example, the alchemical soul signifies the active substance of the sun or of gold. Now this is an understandable correlation. Sulfur is highly flammable. It is yellow in its naturally occurring state and even in refinement. And you can color it, but it is naturally occurring as yellow. It is a natural association with the sun. It is perfectly understandable why it is the way it is. The Trinity consists of salt, mercury, and it's salt, mercury, and sulfur. Salt is the body, the salt of the earth. The mercury is the soul, the part that makes the decisions. Quicksilver moving around. And then you have the gold, the sulfur, and that is the Holy Spirit, the fire, the light and logos personified within you, as well as every other person, every other thing. If it's a noun, it's got the logos in it, right? Whether it is a plant, an animal, even the air, if it is a noun, it has the logos in it. Therefore, not any single noun could have ever been the logos personified in and of itself. And I got a video for that, The Divine in the Trinity Explained, if you are interested in more. But this is absolutely a correlation that can be made. Sulfur is a very good representation of the spirit. It is highly volatile. It will go up like that. It creates and changes things. It is the catalyst for change. Therefore, it is a very good representative of the spirit. Because of this red sulfur, the alchemical sun, like the corresponding gold, is red. Footnote 10. Our soul is ruddy and burning. Bernardus Travansius goes so far as to say, soul is nothing other than sulfur and quicksilver. This is going to be 2 different concepts. Right? Sulfur is the spirit, quicksilver is the soul. The representative, that's mercury. Mercury and quicksilver are interchangeable terms for the exact same thing. And so this is not true. This is not correct. I don't care how long it's been written down. Soul can be nothing other than sulfur. Quicksilver is not going to be the same representative. It would be better represented by the moon. At least there is a similarity in tone and color. As every alchemist knew, gold owes its red color to the admixture of copper, which he interpreted as Kypris, the Cyprian Venus, mentioned in Greek alchemy as the transformative substance. 11. Olympiodorus, smeared with the leaves of the shining goddess, the red Cyprian. But see, there are not leaves of copper. Right? You can make a leaf out of copper. I'm not saying that. But that is not the proper terminology throughout history for the element of copper at all. There is no real reason to make this connection, right? Which he interpreted as Kypris, mentioned in the Greek alchemy as the transformative substance, does not match this footnote. Soul is nothing other than sulfur and quicksilver. Those are two different things. Two completely different things representing two completely different processes. One is transformative, one is mutative. Redness, heat, and dryness are the classical qualities of the Egyptian Set. Greek typhon, the evil principle, which, like the alchemical sulfur, is closely connected with the devil. Would be change, right? Temptation would be change. The light bringer would be bringing fire. So that again is a good allegory. Now, I do not see this as evil. I mean, there is evil. Evil is a real thing. Intentionally murdering someone is evil. Intentionally taking self-gratification from someone who is not consenting, that is evil, right? These are evil steps. These are evil processes. Incest is evil. Incest is evil. Let me hit that one more time. Incest is evil. All right? And so there is objectively good and evil. I mean, the destruction of life with no cause is going to be intrinsically evil. But it ain't the devil that made you do it, right? Now, the devil as an allegory for trying to find knowledge, eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? That works, right? As the light bringer, bringing the idea that there is sin, bringing the idea that you can overcome, that there is something to overcome even. That is true. There is this whole assumption that God made this man and this woman to be partners and they didn't have sexual relations. That is not in the book. What is in the book is that they understood that those things should be private, and so they covered themselves because it was a sin to not have it to be private. Not that they were not copulating, right? It was entirely possible that they were copulating with no progeny. That does happen. And it is even entirely possible that the expulsion from Eden, which I have an alternative theory about, right? It involves fire. The discharge from the sun would even be the causative event in what I am talking about. The expulsion from just wandering around until you have the knowledge that there are greater things. That was, in my estimation, and facilitated by the Son, God's representative here, giving us the Spirit. And it changed us to the capacity to understand, taking us from primal gatherers, not hunter-gatherers, just gatherers, into people who planted crops. And then, there's a whole chain of events that happen. There is no reason to believe that there is a co-equal to God who is the tempter of you. There is no reason to believe that. There is a personified entity that has the capacity to go and talk to the eternal. I don't believe that that is true. There are entities, some of them can tempt you, none of them are co-equal to God in the slightest bit. They might be co-equal to you, right? Existing on a different plane of existence, just the same as your dog is co-equal to you, but they exist on a lesser plane of existence, so they are our responsibility to take care of. They are still a life. They still deserve dignity and respect. They still deserve kindness and generosity, right? All of these things, that is true for the entire scale of existence. Some of those entities do not take that into account, right? Our predators here on the mortal coil, they're like that, right? They don't have remorse over killing things. We do that. And so there is no reason to believe that there is a devil at all. And again, I refer you to the Bible study. And just as Typhon had his kingdom in the Forbidden Sea, so the sun, as Sol Centralis, has its sea, its crude perceptible water, and as Sol Colestis, its subtle, imperceptible water. This seawater, aqua pontica, is extracted from sun and moon. Unlike the Typhonian sea, the life-giving power of this water is praised, though this does not mean that it is invariably good. Footnote 12. The sulfur parable where the water is most dangerous. If there is sulfur in the water, it is most dangerous. Right, sulfur forms sulfur dioxide. Is that the acid? There's hydrogen sulfide. That is a gas that can kill you. There is sulfuric acid, which is formed by it being in water. Right, sulfur concentrated in water creates sulfuric acid, which is dangerous. It is the equivalent of the two-faced mercurius, whose poisonous nature is often mentioned. The Typhonian aspect of the active sun substance, of the red sulfur, of the water that does not make the hands wet. Footnote 13. Hogland, the Atrica chemicum. Water that does not make the hands wet. Interesting. And of the sea water should not be left out of account. I am unfamiliar with what this reference is, right? I'm not going to go back to the Atrica chemicum and find it right now. But it is very interesting. I would like to know what that is. If you know what that is, drop it down below. The author of the Novum Lumen Chemicum cannot suppress a reference to the latter's paradoxical nature. Do not be disturbed because you sometimes find contradictions in my treatises after the custom of the philosophers. These are necessary if you understand that no rose is found without thorns. 14. That is intentional obscurity. 14. Museum Hermetica by White. Right now, that's what this is the intentional obfuscation. That is something that was necessary. The Catholic Church had a tendency to kill you if you were seeking true knowledge, especially if you were trying to record and dispense true knowledge, right? That directly contradicts the control system, and all of the things that the Catholic Church is built upon is a lie. And so it was necessary to hide things, right? Contradictions in my treatise after the custom of the philosophers is directly hiding things, right? I don't do that. I don't have to worry about those clubs, right? We don't have those problems today. We might in a couple of months, but we don't right now. And so this is talking about directly obfuscating on purpose, hiding things. That is why the rose has thorns. The active sun substance also has favorable effects. As the so-called balsam, it drips from the sun and produces lemon, oranges, wines, and, in the mineral kingdom, gold. 15. Steve Paracelsus, the Natura Rerum, says, now the life of man is none other than an astral balsam, a balsamic impression, a heavenly and invisible fire, an enclosed air. Treating of certain invisible virtue, he calls it balsam, surpassing all bodily nature, which preserves the two bodies by conjunction, and upholds the celestial body together with the four elements. Interesting. None other than the astral balsam, a heavenly and invisible fire, an enclosed air, would to me be the representative of the Spirit. A heavenly and invisible fire is going to be the Holy Spirit, the light, the life, the Logos. In everyone, but in no one in particular. He calls it a balsam surpassing all bodily nature, which preserves the two bodies by conjunction and upholds the celestial body together with the four elements, is still going to be the Spirit. Surpassing all bodily nature, the Spirit is within you. It is without you as well, and it surpasses your entire bodily nature. You are encapsulated right now with air. Air is the Spirit just as much as you are. Preserves the two bodies by conjunction. That is going to be the binding together of the earthly and the spiritual. The Spirit does that. That is the facilitator between what you think and the actions that are taken. That again is the spirit. And upholds the celestial body together with the four elements is also going to be the spirit. The spirit is what holds all things. It is every element. It is going to hold the celestial body together with the four elements. Absolutely. That's the spirit. Right? In man, the balsam forms the radical moisture from the sphere of the supra-celestial waters. It is the shining or lucent body. All right, so let's hit this real quick too. You know what the supra-celestial waters are? Space, right? He separated the waters above from the waters below. We walk in that space between. There is water underneath your feet most of the time, unless you're in it. And there are waters above your head. But it's not the clouds. That's not what he's talking about. The waters above your heads is the infinite expanse of space. That is the waters above, the supra-celestial waters. And you are made out of stardust. The exact same things that compose the sun, Alpha Centauri, or the Orion constellation, is the exact same things that compose you. The exact same things that are free floating around you right now in the air, the spirit, completely compose you. There is oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, all of the elements free floating around you. Gold and silver, they're there too. A little bit of lead even. Right? All of these things are free floating around you right now. That is this. It is the shining or lucent body which from man's birth enkindles the inner warmth, and from which come all the motions of the will and the principle of appetition. Again, the spirit. All right. The lucent body, that is the astral body, the soul, or not even the soul, the spirit. Right? The soul is not the astral body. Well, it is the thing that you project, but it doesn't have its own body. Right? The spirit kind of does. It is the fire within. Right? And so lucent means light, lucent body, light body. It makes sense. From man's birth enkindles the inner warmth. That's the spirit. From which come all of the motions of the will. That's the spirit. And the principle of all appetition. The desire to eat, where you get your fuel. The spirit does what? It keeps you alive. The spirit is the thing that makes your heart beat. The spirit is the thing that takes your breath and distributes it to your fingertips. That would be the inner warmth. It's the part that takes your food and transfers it into fuel. That would be the inner warmth and the appetition. And then the motions of the will, guess what that is? I talk about this all of the time. Somebody's about to get mad, but whenever you would decide to wiggle your fingers, you don't do that. Your soul, the part that resides inside of the 5D navigation device, makes a decision, and then the spirit enables that. You send the signal through the spirit to your fingers. And that's what happens. It is an electrical discharge, the logos, in motion. You can also see the logos personified, right, in fire or in lightning. Lightning is electrical discharge. It is the exact same thing that makes your fingers wiggle. The motions of the will. The will is the soul deciding. The motions come from the spirit. Confirmation bias acknowledged. This is exactly what I would expect to find. In the Liber Platonis Quartorum, a Sabaean treatise, the Spiritus Animalis, or solar sulfur, is still a ministering spirit or familiar, who can be conjured up by magical invocations to help with the work. Okay. We'll read the footnote and then talk. 17. Well, theatrical chemicum by itself. All right, so this is true as well. The spiritus animalis is going to be the soul or the spirit, right? Not the part that's making the decision, but the part that acts it out. The soul or sulfur. And ministering spirit means that it is external to you, and it is, but it's internal as well. You are composed entirely of it, and it is existent without you. When you go into meditation, it will reveal itself to you as the interior sun. Even if you are in a dark room, all light blocked out, and you go into a meditative state and you're working on balancing your flows, the sun will unfold itself to you. You will see it. It will be blinding. Your eyes will squint in a dark room because the light is overpowering. But you can use that light. That is what can be conjured up by magical invocations to help with the work. That is it exactly. That is the exact same thing that you are going to use. Exactly. The spirit. Exactly. Not necessarily a familiar because it cannot be personified, but the image of it that you see is the light because it is the light. It is the fire. It is the thing that motivates you and animates you. Back to the text. From what has been said about the active sun substance, it should be clear that soul in alchemy is much less a definite chemical substance than a virtus, a mysterious power. Footnote 18. It were vain to believe, as many do, that the sun is merely a heavenly fire, believed to have a generative and transformative effect. 19. The alchemists still believe with Proclus that the sun generates the gold. This is one of the assumptions that we make. Right? We don't actually know where gold came from. We have assumptions that we make about it. The assumption that we make is this. Right? This is the assumption that we make. That the sun creates it. That it was not necessarily our sun, right? But that the assumption is that at some point in some place there was an explosion of a sun, and that is what created the gold. I am of the opinion, and it is an opinion, it is not a fact, that the sun, when it has its discharges, which it absolutely does, the sun has micronovas. That means that it blows up a little bit, not entirely. It forms a crust and blows that crust off. Part of that is an electromagnetic discharge. We call them filaments, right? They look like little wires that lay on top of the sun, and every once in a while they go pew, and they blast off electromagnetic radiation in whatever direction they go. It is entirely within the scope of reason that at some point that filament came in our direction. That it may have even contacted the earth, possibly on the border to India and Pakistan, where I place Eden. And where it touched down, right, that's not the only place it touched down. Right, that is the one that we have the record of from Genesis. Wherever it touches down, and there are many places, we have a tendency to find gold. That is a true thing. Now, a true thing, in my estimation, under my assumption about things, right, is not a fact, but we do have a lot of gold in our crust. It came from somewheres. This is a good explanation for it because what have we done here as a species? We've created gold through electromagnetic radiation. There is no real process by which gold can be created outside of that electromagnetic bombardment, especially in mass quantities. The density and the weight of it makes it difficult for it to create naturally. But it is an element. It was existent, and maybe the discharge just brought it together. Maybe it transformed it. This is theories that I have. But my theory comports with science, at least in a small way, right? They believe that it was a nova of some sort. I believe that it was a micronova or a filament discharge from our sun. That is not a direct one-on-one, but it is at least a correlation in the right direction. And so I do believe that this is at least partly true. Just as the physical sun lightens and warms the universe. Wow, that is a big assumption. So, in the human body, there is in the heart a sun-like arcanum, from which life and warmth stream forth. That is true, right? This is an assumption, right? You are assuming that the sun warms the entire universe. That's a big leap. There's a lot of distance between us and Alpha Centauri. I think that's the closest star to us, right? It is doubtful that much heat gets to Alpha Centauri, much less to some of the further extremities in space. They have their own sources. But here is something that you may not know. They are connected. There is a pathway between all of the stars, and they interchange energetic emissions quite frequently. That is traceable, trackable. It has been proven. Even though I don't think they have gotten our star, they have got it between other stars. All right. Therefore, soul, says Dorn, is rightly named the first after God and the father and begetter of all. Footnote 21. Zosimos cites the saying of Hermes, the sun is the maker of all things. And I've already explained that, right? Photosynthesis is the cause of life. Without photosynthesis, there is no life. Without the sun, there is no photosynthesis. The father and begetter of all, because in him the seminal and formal virtue of all things whatsoever lies hid. Footnote 22. Physica Trismegistus, the Codex Beryl, says of the germ cell of the egg, the sun point, that is, the gem of the egg, which is the yolk. This power is called sulfur. 23. The first and most powerful male and universal seed is, by its nature, sulfur, the first and most powerful cause of all generation. Wherefore Paracelsus says that the sun and man, through man, generate man. And again, sulfur, being the spirit, is the first and most powerful cause of all generation. The divine and the Trinity explained. It is a hot, demonic principle of life, having the closest affinities with the sun and the earth, the central fire, or ignis gehennalis, fire of hell. Hence, there is also a sol niger, a black sun, which coincides with the negredo and putrefactio, the state of death. 24. Cf. Infra. The alchemical sun also rises out of the darkness of the earth, as in aurora consurgence. This earth made the moon, then the sun arose, after the darkness which hath appointed therein before the sunrise. There are theories. Right? It is entirely possible that the earth did indeed make the moon. It has the same elemental composition in ways that you would expect to find here. That is true. We have been there. I know some people hold contention with that. I really don't care. If you believe that the earth is flat and that we have never been off of it, do you, boo. This is not the study for you. But the earth made the moon is within the realm of hypotheses. Right? There is possibly a correlation between a strike from a cosmic source of some type that may have broken off a piece of our planet, which then would form the moon, right? As the sphere being the natural shape that you would find in the vacuum. And there are legends of people witnessing this happen. Now, whether those are true or not, that is definitely up for debate. It is highly in the realm of speculation. But there is at least some legends of this thing happening, the earth making the moon. The sun arose. There are also fairly significant reasons to believe that at one point in time, exactly how far ago is up for debate, that there was a different solar alignment than we are currently configured in. That the planets lined up in direct magnetic correlation with each other, and that the sun, as we view it, was obscured. There are significant reasons to believe that particular theory. I am not going to deep dive that into here today, but if you want to look at the Tychos model of the solar system, the recent developments, not necessarily the original ones, there is significant reason to believe that that might be a thing. All right, back to the text. Like Mercurius, soul in alchemy is ambivalent. The miraculous power of the sun, says Dorn, is due to the fact that all the simple elements are contained in it, as they are in heaven and in other heavenly bodies, and in you and in the dogs and in the lizards and the fishes. I mean, that is not the miraculous power of the sun. The miraculous power of the sun is its ability to convey energy into a way that we are able to use it. That is a miracle, right? Direct electromagnetic discharge that allows us to create life. That is the miracle, right? It's not the fact that all simple elements are contained in it. We do not know that, right? It is entirely possible. It is well within the realm of possibility. But we cannot confirm that. We have not been there. We have not seen that there is not some of the elements missing, right? There may not be any carbon at all on the planet or on the sun, right? That is a possibility, right? It is hot. Carbon is combustible. It is entirely possible that there is no carbon contained on the sun whatsoever. Right? Now, it might be in the form of a diamond. That would be carbon. Fine, okay. But we don't know that. We assume that. We make assumptions because of things. Now, I am firmly convinced that the Holy Spirit is all of the elements in perfection, right? The Logos is the combination of those elements. But the combination can exclude. And so it is entirely possible that the sun accreted in the way that it is, and that it does not contain some of the elements. Now, I believe that we contain all of the elements, and that the sun does too, but in lesser degree, even. That is an assumption that I make, but this is an assumption that other people make. I mean, the miraculous power of the sun is the generation to me, the fact that it is Logos in effect. We say that the sun is a single element, he continues, tacitly identifying it with the quintessence. And see, it cannot be a single element and have all the simple elements in it. This view is explained by a remarkable passage from the Mysterium Coniunctionis. The philosophers maintained that the father of the gold and silver is the animating principle, animal, of earth and water, or man, or part of man, such as hair, blood, menstruum, etc. Footnote 25. Ars chemical. On a primitive level, blood is the seat of the soul. Hair signifies strength and divine power. If you listen to Judges, which I do not recommend at all, the philosophers maintain that the Father of gold and silver is the animating principle of earth and water. As the Holy Spirit, that would be true. The idea at the back of this is that primitive conception of a universal power of growth, healing, magic, and prestige. Footnote 26. The works of Lehmann, Proust, and Rohr, a collection of mana concepts, can be found in my On Psychic Energy. Right. The idea at the back of this is the primitive conception of a universal power of growth, healing, magic, and prestige. That, again, I believe is true as well. You can take control of the electromagnetic forces through your sheer force of will. That is what I do. That is what I explain in this book and give instructions on how to accomplish in your own life. And so I do believe this. Right now, prestige is the desiring of things. Growth, healing, and magic are things that you can do, but prestige is a little bit prideful, right? If you are doing good works, you should be recognized for that, and that is prestige as well. But there is the temptation for pridefulness involved with the word of prestige, which is to be found as much in the sun as in men and plants, is true, right? The Logos is in everything. So that not only the sun, but man too, and especially the enlightened man, the adept, can generate the gold by virtue of this universal power. Now, I have done that with spiritual gold. I do that on a daily basis. It is fairly easy for me, right? That is uniting the body with the soul through the heart, creating the reality that you exist upon. But it is also making the best out of a situation, is making alchemical gold on a spiritual level. No matter how many bad things happen, finding the bright sunny side of it is alchemical gold. And so that is something that I do, man does, right? And I do not say that I get it right all of the time. I do not claim that at all, but I do strive to do so all of the time. It was clear to Dorn, and to other alchemists as well, that the gold was not made by the usual chemical procedures. Footnote 27. And in this wise, alchemy is supernatural and is divine, and in this stone is all the difficulty of the art, nor can any sufficient natural reason be adduced why this should be so. And thus And thus it is when the intellect cannot comprehend this nor satisfy itself, but must yet believe it, as in miraculous divine matters, even as the foundation of the Christian faith, being supernatural, must be first be taken as true by unbelievers, because its end is attained miraculously and supernaturally. Therefore God alone is the operator, nature taking no part in the work. Alchemy is supernatural and is divine, is true, but you are a representative of the divine. You are not divine, you are not a god, but you are a tiny sliver of the god, the soul that you possess in your 5D navigation device that makes the decisions for you. That is the individualized piece of God that is given to you for this. And so that part is true, right? Alchemy, both physical and spiritual, is supernatural, right? The ability that I have to create that gold, I believe, comes from the God. So, the intellect cannot comprehend nor satisfy itself, but must yet believe it. True. As in miraculous divine matters, right? You have to believe that it is possible, or else it is not possible. Right? You will not be able to harness your will if you do not believe that that is a possibility. It is something you will not be able to do. Now, this is telling you something. Because its end is attained miraculously and supernaturally. What end? Okay. I'm going to try. By the usual chemical procedures, for which reason he called gold making a miracle. The miracle was performed by a natura abscontia, hidden nature, a metaphysical entity perceived not with the outward eyes, but solely by the mind. And that is, again, something I agree with. That is just a reference to another book. It was infused from heaven. Footnote 29. For I could not wonder enough at the great virtue of the thing which is bestowed upon and infused into it from heaven. And I do believe that it is coming from God. Now, I do not believe that there is a physical heaven as described in the book, right? There is the source that we return to. What physicality that takes, I have no idea. I'm not even going to try to speculate upon it. Provided that the adept, but I do know that it is not what is contained in the New Testament. Provided that the adept had approached as closely as possible to things divine, and at the same time had extracted from the substances the subtlest powers fit for the miraculous act. There is, in the human body, a certain ethereal substance which preserves its other elemental parts and causes them to continue. That is true. 30. There is a similar passage on page 457. Further, in the human body is concealed a certain substance of heavenly nature, known to very few, which needeth no medicament, but itself, being itself the incorrupt medicament. This, again, is to me going to be the spirit. Once again, that is going to be true. I have healed myself. That would be what the medicament is, right? I believe that that healing came from the spirit, the ethereal substance that is within you. This substance or virtue is hindered in its operations by the corruption of the body. But the philosophers, through a kind of divine inspiration, knew that this virtue and heavenly vigor can be freed from its fetters, not by its contrary, but by its like. 31. That is just page 457. All right. Hindered in its operations by the corruption of the body, that is going to be true, right? If you are not intentionally trying to use it, it is not going to be intentionally used. It is unintentionally used, right? It is the part that keeps your heart beating. It keeps you breathing when you are asleep, right? And so that is, heavenly vigor can be freed from, wait, that's the wrong spot. Hindered in its operations by the corruption of the body. But the philosophers, through a kind of divine inspiration, knew that this virtue and heavenly vigor can be freed from its fetters. That is what I talk about in here. Not by its contrary, but by its like. It is going to be by balancing the virtues and the vices in the way that I describe. That is my confirmation bias. Take it with a grain of salt. Dorn calls it veritas, which would be truth. It is the supreme power and unconquerable fortress which hath but very few friends and is besieged by innumerable enemies. It is defended by the immaculate Lamb and signifies the heavenly Jerusalem in the inner man. In this fortress is the true and indubitable treasure, which is not eaten into by moths nor dug out by thieves, but remaineth forever and is taken hence after death. That would only be your love, right? 32. All right, we do not have another one until 35. For Dorn, then, the spark of divine fire implanted in man becomes what Goethe, in his original version of Faust, called Faustus Intellecti, which was carried away by the angels. This supreme treasure, the animal man understandeth not. We are made like stones, having eyes and seeing not. After all this, we can say that the alchemical soul, as a certain luminosity, is in many respects equal to the lumen naturae. This was the real source of illumination in alchemy, and from alchemy Paracelsus borrowed this same source in order to illuminate the art of medicine. Thus, the concept of soul has not a little to do with the growth of modern consciousness, which in the last 2 centuries has relied more and more on the observation and experience of natural objects. Soul, therefore, seems to denote an important psychological fact. Consequently, it is well worthwhile delineating its peculiarities in greater detail on the basis of the very extensive literature. Generally, soul is regarded as the masculine and active half of Mercurius, the supraordinate concept whose psychology I have discussed in a separate study. Since, in his alchemical form, Mercurius does not exist in reality, he must be an unconscious projection, and because he is an absolutely fundamental concept in alchemy, he must signify the unconscious itself. That is an extrapolation that is not necessarily true. Generally, soul is regarded as the masculine and active half is going to be in direct accordance with what I believe, right? There is the void, which is the unfathomable, containing darkness, and then there is the infinitesimal point, which would be soul. That is the point which penetrates the darkness. The masculine is the part that penetrates. The feminine is the part that takes. That would be a direct correlation to this. But it is also the light and the dark powers, as I describe in here, being masculine and feminine in the exact same way for the exact same reason. Since it does not exist in reality, is not going to be true, right? This, as the half of this, right, the dark and the light are 2 halves of the same coin. Masculine and feminine are not necessarily separated in the way that you would think. You contain both masculine and feminine traits, no matter what sex you have. And so, this thing is existent, right? We do have a sun. There is light coming into our void. That is true, right? It does exist in reality. He must be an unconscious projection. Why? We have a literal thing that can be, right? Now, Mercurius does not exist, but it is an allegory for the light and the dark in balance. And so, it does not have to be the unconscious itself. Now, you do use the unconscious to create. That is true, kind of. But you can use the conscious to create as well. And in fact, if you do that, it works a lot better. Right? If you are taking intentional steps, that works better than taking unintentional steps every single time. But you do it unconsciously. If you have not taken part in the enlightenment process, you are probably still making decisions based upon incomplete knowledge. You are still speaking things into existence that are not necessarily true. You can talk about yourself in a negative light and create that. That's not unconscious necessarily, right? But it is not you consciously taking the control. When you consciously take the control, you get to direct those thoughts. You no longer talk negatively about yourself, but instead speak positively, and you create that. That is a fundamental concept in alchemy. That right there is the fundamental concept in alchemy that does not necessarily signify unconscious self. Right? You can use it intentionally. That would be consciousness. He is, by his very nature, the unconscious where nothing can be differentiated. But, as spiritus vegetavius, living spirit, he is an active principle and so must always appear in reality in differentiated form. He is therefore fittingly called duplex, both active and passive. The ascending, active part of him is called soul, and it is only through this that the passive part can be perceived. The passive part therefore bears the name of Luna, because she borrows her light from the sun. Footnote 35. The ancient idea that the sun corresponds to the right eye and the moon to the left. The right and left hand path are definitely something. Right? And this, the passive part, would be the part that takes within itself and is personified by the Luna because she represents the darkness, because the moon is in the dark. Right? But a better representative of that is the waters above, in which reside individual points of light. Mercurius demonstrably corresponds to the cosmic nous of the classical philosophers. That would be the creative element of speaking aloud the thing. The human mind is a derivative of this, and so, likewise, is the diurnal life of the psyche, which we call consciousness. Footnote 36. Just as for the natural philosophers of the Middle Ages, the sun was the god of the physical world, so the little god of the world is consciousness. Consciousness requires as its necessary counterpart a dark, latent, non-manifest side, the unconscious, whose presence can only be known by the light of consciousness. Now that is mostly true. 37. Consciousness, like the sun, is an eye of the world. Since Plato calls the sun the visible Son of God, why do we not understand that we are the image of the invisible Sun? And if he is the true light enlightening every mind, he hath as his most express image the sun, which is the light of the image enlightening every body. We are the image of the invisible sun, but so is a dog, so is a cat, so is a lizard, so is a daisy. Right? All of them are representatives of God. God created them individually as they are for a purpose, every single one of them. Right? There is a man-centered viewpoint that we have because we have the capacity to cognate that makes us think that we are better than other things, and that thinking that we are better than other things makes us think that God is exactly like us up there. That is an assumption that is made that has no firm foundational basis whatsoever. There is no reason to believe that we are the image of God more than an animal is, at all, or a tree, at all. In fact, the tree would be a better personification. It doesn't have the capacity for evil, right? All right. Just as the day star rises out of the nocturnal sea, so ontogenetically and phylogenetically, consciousness is born of unconsciousness and sinks back every night to this primal condition. Right? Unconsciousness is the state you act in when you are not taking direct action. Right? You can do that when you're asleep, for sure. Right? You are asleep, you are unconscious, you still have thoughts, we call them dreams. But if you are awake and you are not taking active part in your life, you are acting unconsciously. Right? If you are not investigating the things that you believe, you're acting on belief and not knowledge. There is a difference between the two. Right? You can receive knowledge and not turn it into wisdom. Wisdom is the practical application of knowledge. Both of those, attaining knowledge and refining it into the goal that is wisdom, both require you to consciously think about it, to cognate upon it. Right? You use your unconscious mind whether you will it or not. If you are just sitting idly and breathing, you are using your unconscious. And so it is an intrinsic part of you. And you can only recognize that once you have decided to take the consciousness into yourself and to make conscious decisions. Now you question your belief systems. You may still maintain them, but now you know why. That is a conscious decision as opposed to the unconscious continuation of a tradition. You can use both, right? Constantly throughout your life. I take a lot of conscious decision in my life, but there are still unconscious parts. This duality of our psychic life is the prototype and archetype of the soul luna symbolism. So much did the alchemist sense the duality of his unconscious assumptions that, in the face of all astronomical evidence, he equipped the sun with a shadow. The sun and its shadow bring the work to perfection. Now, the sun, there is only a shadow if something obscures the light, right? These glasses do not have an intrinsic shadow. The shadow is only there if there is light. And then the physical practicality of this obscures the light, creating the shadow. And so the sun does have a shadow. If you are outside, your shadow is actually the sun shadow. It is the light being obscured. That is pedantic, right? That is arguing some definitional things that don't even really need arguing. But allegorically, right? The sun and its shadow would be the light and the dark. That would be the masculine and the feminine. The sun and its shadow together in balance bring the work to perfection. That is true. Did I read the footnote? No. This idea occurs already in Turba. But he who hath tends the poison of the sages with the sun and its shadow hath attained the greatest secret. And again, that is going to comport with what I just said. Tends the poison of the sages, the death of the mind, the unconscious non-thought, with the sun and its shadow, bringing into balance the masculine and the feminine, hath attained to the greatest secret. I agree with that. Michael Meyer, from whom this saying is taken, avoids the onus of explanation by substituting the shadow of the earth for the shadow of the sun in the 45th discourse of his Scrutinium. Evidently, he could not wholly shut his eyes to astronomical reality, but then he cites the classical saying of Hermes, "Sun, extract from the ray its shadow." Find the balance. 39. From Chapter 2 of the Tractus Aureus. Thus, giving us clearly to understand that the shadow is contained in the sun's rays and hence could be extracted from them. Whatever this might mean, it means that there can be no shadow without light. Right, but also, extracting from the ray its shadow is the shadow work. It is the balancing of the virtues and the vices, the balancing between the masculine and the feminine. That is extracting. I mean, that is what this is talking about. Closely related to this saying is the alchemical idea of a black sun, often mentioned in the literature. 40. Mylius. Here, the sol niger is synonymous with the caput corvi and denotes the anima media natura in the state of negredo, which appear when the earth of the gold is dissolved by its own proper spirit. Psychologically, this means a provisional extinction of the conscious standpoint owing to an invasion from the unconscious. Mylius refers to the ancient philosophers as a source for the sol negere. A similar passage occurs in 118. The sun is obscured at its birth, and this denigration is the beginning of the work, the sign of putrefaction and the sure beginning of the commixture. This negredo is the changing darkness of purgatory. Ripley speaks of a dark sun, adding, "You must go through the gates of the blackness if you would gain the light of paradise in the whiteness." All of this is explainable by the things that I do in this book. Right? Every single part of this comports exactly with this. Right? This The earth of the gold is dissolved by its own proper spirit is you going into the spirit. A provisional extension of the conscious standpoint by an invasion from the unconscious, that is the darkness of the depression coming upon you. Mylius refers to the ancient philosophers as the source. The sun is obscured at its birth is the spiritual amnesia that you get, that you do not know that you can do these things. This denigration is the beginning of the work. It is indeed. You're not remembering that this is a intentional incarnation for the experience is part of the experience. It is the beginning of the work. And a sign of putrefaction, which is degradation not being aligned properly. And the beginning of the commixture, the awareness of. You must then, the changing darkness of purgatory speaks of the dark sun adding, you must go through the gate of the blackness if you would gain the light of paradise and the whiteness. Is fairly close to what I explain when I am talking about balancing the forces, right? There is the light penetrative force and there is the dark absorptive force. You have access to both and should use both in your endeavors. Back to the text. This notion is supported by the self-evident fact that without light there is no shadow, so that, in a sense, the shadow too is emitted by the sun. For this, physics requires a dark object interposed between the sun and the observer, a condition that does not apply to the alchemical soul, since occasionally it appears as black itself. It contains both light and darkness. For what, in the end, asked Meyer, is the sun without a shadow, the same as the bell without a clapper? While soul is the most precious thing, its shadow is a res villissimia or quid vilius alga, more worthless than seaweed. The antinomian thinking of alchemy counters every position with a negation and vice versa. Outwardly they are all bodily things, but inwardly they are spiritual, says Signor. 41. De Chemicum, page 91. This view is true of all alchemical qualities. Each thing bears in itself the opposite. I agree. 42. The Sol Nagar is the counter-sun, just as there is an invisible sun enclosed in the center of the earth. A similar idea is found in Ventura, and as at the beginning the sun is hidden in the moon, so hidden at the end is extracted from the moon. Interesting. Alright, so the counter sun being the invisible sun enclosed in the center of the earth, that is a thing. We have an iron core, and that iron core absorbs electromagnetic radiation. That plus friction keeps it in a molten state. That molten state would definitely resemble the sun if you were able to observe it. It even emits heat, right? To the alchemical way of thinking, the shadow is no mere priviato lucis, just as the bell and its clapper are of a tangible substantiality, so too are light and shadow. Only thus can the saying of Hermes be understood. In its entirety it runs, Sun, extract from the ray its shadow and the corruption that arises from the mists which gather about it. Befoul it, and veil its light, for it is consumed by necessity and by its redness. 43. Tractus Aureus. Here, the shadow is thought of quite concretely. It is a mist that is capable not only of obscuring the sun, but of befouling it. Quinquinati, a strong expression. Right, that is the non-intentional use. Right, if you are not intentionally using, then it can be befouled by the darkness within. The redness, rubido, of the sun's light is a reference to the red sulfur in it, the active burning principle, destructive in its effects. In man, the natural sulfur, Dorn says, is identical with an elemental fire, which is the cause of corruption, and this fire is enkindled by an invisible sun unknown to many, that is, the sun of the philosophers. The natural sulfur tends to revert to its first nature, so that the body becomes sulphurous and fitted to receive the fire that corrupts man back to his first essence. Footnote 44. Dorn. He conceives it in the first place as physiologically destructive action which turns the salt in the body into chalk, so that the body becomes sulfurous. But this medical observation is introduced by the remark, because man is engendered in corruption, his own substance pursues him with hatred. By this he means original sin and the corruption resulting therefrom. The sun is evidently an instrument in the physiological and psychological drama of return to the prima materia, the death that must be undergone if man is to get back to the original condition of the simple elements and attain the incorrupt nature of the pre-worldly paradise. For Dorn, this process was spiritual and moral as well as physical. Soul appears here in a dubious, indeed a sulphurous light. It corrupts, obviously, because of the sulfur it contains. Footnote 45. I am not forgetting that the dangerous quality of soul may be due to the fact that his rays contain the miraculous water, which, by the power of the magnet, is extracted from the rays of the sun and moon. The water is a putrefying agent because, before it is properly cooked, it is a deadly poison. This aqua permanens is the divine water, the divinity being sulfur. It is called sulfur water, and it is the same as mercury. No, it is not. And Homer was believed to possess apotropaic powers, and this may be the reason why it is called divine. I'm going to look this up. What does that mean? Intended to ward off evil, having the power to prevent evil or bad luck. Interesting. Now, we talked before what happens if you put sulfur in water. You get sulfuric acid. Accordingly, soul is the transformative substance, the prima materia, as well as the gold tincture. The anonymous treatise, the Alchemical, distinguishes two parts or stages of the lapis. The first part is called the soul terraneous, earthly sun. Without the earthly sun, the work is not perfected. Footnote 46. 46 is just a reference to another book. In the second part of the work, soul is joined with Mercurius. On earth, these stones are dead, and they do nothing unless the activity of man is applied to them. Consider 47. The text only has the without a verb. We got it. Okay. The profound analogy of the gold, the ethereal heaven was locked to all men, so that all men had to descend into the underworld where they were imprisoned forever. But Christ Jesus unlocked the gate of the heavenly Olympus and threw open the realm of Pluto, that the souls might be freed, when the Virgin Mary, with the cooperation of the Holy Ghost in an unutterable mystery and deepest sacrament, conceived in her virgin womb that which was most excellent in heaven and upon earth, and finally bore for us the Redeemer of the whole world, who, by his overflowing goodness, shall save all who are given up to sin, if only the sinner shall turn to him. But the Virgin remained incorrupt and inviolate, therefore not without good reason is Mercurius made equal to the most glorious and worshipful Virgin Mary. What is that 48? 48 is just a reference. Alright, so once again I'm going to point out that there is no prophecy of a virgin birth contained in the Old Testament. What Isaiah said was, "Give me a sign that you want to see, O king." And the king said no. And now Isaiah said, "Alright, fine, I will give you one. This woman right here, this maiden right here, will conceive and give birth, and his name will be Emmanuel. And before he is eating cheese, the Babylonians will come and take you into captivity." He gave that prophecy, and it exactly played out as he said. Now, there is very good reason to believe that that prophecy was written after the Babylonian captivity. But regardless, the way that the prophecy is represented is that there's a maiden, which is an unmarried woman, not necessarily a virgin, would give birth to this child. His name would be Emmanuel. And then before he reached the age of 2-ish, the Babylonians would come. And it played out exactly like that. It wasn't named Jesus, right? It wasn't named Yeshua. It wasn't named Isis or whatever else. It was named Emmanuel. And that Emmanuel, before he was 2, the Babylonians came and took him into captivity. Prophecy given, prophecy fulfilled in the same book. It does not, anywhere in there, imply that there will be a virgin birth a couple of thousand years later. And that virgin birth would be the salvation of mankind. That is not contained in the text. I refer you to the text. I have read it aloud in the exact same way that we are doing here. And so this whole part right here is just simply not true, right? It was not a virgin birth. She did not remain a virgin. It tells you in the Bible that Jesus had brothers and sisters. Where did they come from? Now, he may have been the first, right? But there were others. It is evident from this that the conjunctio of Sol and Mercurius is not a hierogamos, with Mercurius playing the role of bride. If one does not find this analogy too offensive, one may ask oneself with equanimity whether the arcanum of the opus alchemicum, as understood by the old masters, may not indeed be considered an equivalent of the dogmatic mystery. Okay, now the idea of the bride and the man and the woman coming together, that is the masculine and the feminine being balanced. And so there is a role of the bride that you are to take by accepting into yourself the light of the Lord. But you are not awaiting some bridegroom that is coming back possibly today, possibly in 4,000 years, right? No clear definitive timeline, no real reason or way to discern a good timeline. The hearts of men will wax cold. When have they ever been fucking warm? Right? Like, we are the warmest towards other people now that we have ever been, and we are full of contention still today. But the dogmatic mystery, yeah, there's a lot of that. For the psychologist, the decisive thing here is the subjective attitude of the alchemist. As I have shown in Psychology and Alchemy, such a profession of faith is by no means unique. Footnote 49. The Lapis-Christ parallel. We're going to have to dive into that, I guess. The metaphorical designation of Christ as soul, 50, especially as Sol Iuste, son of justice, in Malachi. Yeah, I guarantee that is taken wrong. Honorius of Aetun, Speculum de Mysteria Ecclesiae. For, like to the sun beneath the clouds, so did the Son of Justice lie concealed under human flesh. Correspondingly, the Gnostic Anthropos is identical with the Son. I would have to go back and do the whole chapter study on Malachi to get into this. Taking one sentence is not going to do it. That is the problem that you find in Christianity. Cherry picking these things so that you can make what you want out of it, just like in Gematria. And so I have not done, we did not do Malachi in its fullness. I'm fairly positive. And so I do not have the knowledge to pull from that I do for Isaiah, that I do for Daniel. We did most of the works of the Old Testament, not all of them, for reasons. Malachi was a lesser prophet. He was not even really dealing with a lot of the end time stuff. And so, problems, but I cannot extrapolate upon them right now. The metaphorical designation of Christ as soul in the language of the Church Fathers was taken quite literally by the alchemists and applied to their soul tyrannus. When we remember that the alchemical soul corresponds psychologically to consciousness, the diurnal side of the psyche, we must add the Christ analogy to the symbolism. Christ appears essentially as the son of his mother bride. Yeah, nothing wrong with that at all. The role of the son does in fact devolve upon ego consciousnus, since it is the offspring of the maternal unconscious. Now, according to the arch authority, the Tabula Smaragdina, Sol is the father of Mercurius, who in the above quotation appears as feminine and as the mother bride. In that capacity, Mercurius is identical with Luna, and, via the Luna Mary Ecclesia symbolism, is equated with a virgin. Thus, the treatise, Exercitations in Turbum, says, as blood is the origin of flesh, so is Mercurius the origin of soul, and thus Mercurius is soul, and soul is Mercurius. 51. There is no reason to believe that blood is the origin of flesh. There are veins and capillaries and arteries that carry blood into the flesh, but there is no reason to believe that blood is the origin of flesh at all. As a matter of fact, before there is blood in the amniotic sac, you form flesh. Right? First you form bones. Around a protoplasmic embryonic state, first your spinal column forms, the spirit attaching, and then you form flesh, and then you form blood. Right? Where would the blood go if there was no flesh to go in? Right? If there was no heart muscle, there's no way to pump the blood. Soul is therefore father and son at once. I really hate that analogy. And his feminine counterpart is mother and daughter in one person. Furthermore, Sol and Luna are merely aspects of the same substance that is simultaneously the cause and the product of both, namely Mercurius duplex. That, right? It is not a person, right? Personifying it is half the problem. Of whom the philosophers say that he contains everything that is sought by the wise. This train of thought is based on the quaternity. The principle, Mercurius, leading into the filius, Mercurius, led by the father and then the mother, right? That's what the chart is. If you're just listening, there is a cross here. It's not greatly explanatory. Although the soul symbolism is reminiscent of the dogmatic models, its basic schema is very different. For the dogmatic schema is a trinity embracing only the deity, but not the universe. Footnote 52. The alchemical equivalent of the trinity is the three-headed serpent, Mercurius. I have the Trinity. It is the body, the soul, and the spirit. There is the God who created the spirit which he became, and then us. That is the Trinity. In alchemy, it is, well, we've talked about it, salt, fire, and sulfur and mercury, right? That is the exact same Trinity. It's just different ways of saying it. The exact same thing. The alchemical schema appears to embrace only the material world, yet, on account of its quaternary character, it comes near to being the representation of totality, as exemplified in the symbol of the cross erected between heaven and earth. The cross is, by implication, the Christian totality symbol. As an instrument of torture, it expresses the sufferings on earth of the incarnate God, which never happened. As a quaternity, it expresses the universe, which also includes the material world. If we now add to this cruciform schema the four protagonists of the divine world drama, Father as Auctor Requiem, the Son, his counterpart the devil, to fight whom he became man, and the Holy Ghost, we get the following quaternity. Father, Son, Antichrist becomes the Spirit Sanctus. I will not discuss the various aspects of this quaternity more closely here, as I have already done so in a separate study. This is probably just the reference. 53 is, my psychological approach to the dogma of the Trinity. I have the divine and the Trinity explained. Though some may find it objectionable, the opposition between Christ and the devil in the above schema presupposes an inner relationship, regarded by the Epiphanites, says Epiphanius, as that between two brothers. Angelus Silesius seems to have felt something of the sort too. Well, from the devil all his hisness gone, you'd see the devil sitting in God's throne. Co-equal to God, you say. By hisness, Angelus Silius means the selfhood which damns, as is incontestably true of all selfhood that does not acknowledge its identity with God. I would probably agree with that. I mention it only for a comparison with the alchemical one. Quaternities such as these are logical characteristics of Gnostic thinking, which Carl has aptly called circular. 54. The thinking in the Psalms and the prophets is circular. Even the Apocalypse consists of spiral images. One of the main characteristics of Gnostic thinking is its circularity. Carl Jung gives an example from Ephraim Cyrus. Make glad the body through the soul, but give the soul back to the body, that both may be glad after the separation they are joined again. The alchemist could have said the same of the Ouroboros, since this is the primal symbol of alchemical truth. Carl Jung also describes dogma as circular. It is round in the sense of living reality. Dogmas are concerned with the religious reality, and this is circular. He calls attention to the fact of not knowing and not recognizing, which lies at the core of the dogma itself. This remark indicates the reason, or one of the reasons, for the roundness. Dogmas are approximative concepts for a fact that exists, yet cannot be described, and can only be approached by circumambulation. At the same time, these facts are spheres of indeterminable extent, since they represent principles. Psychologically, they correspond to the archetypes. Overlapping and interpenetration are an essential part of their nature. Roundness is a peculiarity not only of dogmas, but in a special degree of alchemical thought. Now, roundness to me is going to be the balancing, right, between the twos, right, between the virtues and the vices, between the light and the dark, the masculine and the feminine. They are represented by roundness if they are complete. The yin-yang is a very good representation of that concept. We have already met similar figures in our account of the opposites, which were often arranged in quaternities. The rhythm of both schemas is divided into 3 steps. Alchemical, beginning origin Mercurius, development soul Luna, goal Filius Mercurius. Christian, auctor Pater, development of conflict Salvator Diabolus. Paraclete, Holy Ghost, Church, or Kingdom of God. The alchemical drama leads from below upwards, from the darkness of the earth to the winged spiritual Filius Macrocosmi, and to the Lex Moderna. The Christian drama, on the other hand, represents the descent of the kingdom of heaven to earth. One has the impression of a mirror world, as if the God-man coming down from above, as in the Gnostic legend, were reflected in the dark waters of Physis. The relation of the unconscious to the conscious mind is, to a certain extent, complementary, as elementary psychogenic symptoms and dreams caused by simple somatic stimuli prove. Footnote 55. Particularly dreams about hunger, thirst, pain, and sex. Another complementary factor is the feminine nature of the unconscious in a man. Hence, the strange idea, taught for instance by Rudolf Steiner, that the hereafter possesses qualities complementary to those of the world. We have done at least one work of Rudolf Steiner. There is no reason to give him a whole lot of consideration. Careful observation and analysis show, however, that not all dreams can be regarded mechanically as mere complementary devices, but must be interpreted rather as attempts at compensation. Right? That is, balancing. Compensation would be finding the balance between what has happened and what you wanted to happen. That's what dreams do. Though this does not prevent very many dreams from having, on a superficial view, a distinct complementary character. Similarly, we could regard the alchemical movement as a reflection of the Christian one. 56. Except that alchemy predates Christianity by a significant amount. For the compensatory effect of this reflection, see Psychology and Alchemy. Carl makes a significant distinction between two aspects of Christ, the descending incarnate God and the ascending Gnostic Christ who returns to the Father. We cannot regard the latter as the same as the alchemical Filius Regius, although Carl schema offers an exact parallel to the alchemical situation. 57. Carl. The Redeemer figure in alchemy is not commensurable with Christ. Whereas Christ is God and is begotten by the Father, the Filius Regius is the soul of nature, born of the world-creating Logos, of the Sapientia Dei, sunk in matter. That comports with what I say. I do, however, also say that Christ was not God, or begotten by the Father, any more than anyone else is begotten by the Father. Right? The creation of the two souls combining into one only happens at the will of the Father, the intentional creation of the Father that is equally in part in everything existent ever. The Filius Regius is the soul of nature, born of the world-creating Logos, and of the Sapientia Dei, the knowledge of God sunk in matter. The Filius Regius is also a son of God, though of a more distant descent and not begotten in the womb of the Virgin Mary, but in the womb of Mother Nature. He is a third sonship in the Basilidian sense. 58. The Spirit Mercurius, in another respect also, the Filius Philosophium, is a third. When we consider the development of the concept of the devil among the Ebionites, they spoke of two figures begotten by God, one of them Christ, the other the devil. The latter, according to Pacellus, was called by the Euchites Sataneo, the elder brother of Christ. In relation to these two, the Filius Regius as Dominum Spiritus Sancti and son of the Prima Materia is the third sonship, which in common with the Prima Materia can trace its descent, though a more distant one, from God. For the threefold sonship, see Hippolytus and Ion, these sonships come from the true light, from the Logos, which is not what is described in John 1:9. The Sapientia Patris, Hippolytus. And again, I refer you to my own video, The Divine and the Trinity Explained. This is already too long to get into it here. But Christ was not the Logos. No traditional influences should be invoked in considering the conceptual structure of this Filius. He is more an autochthonous product, deriving from an unconscious, logical development of trends which had already reached the field of consciousness in the early Christian era, impelled by the same unconscious necessity as produced the later development of ideas. For as our modern experience has shown, the collective unconscious is a living process that follows its own inner laws and gushes up like a spring at the appointed time. That it did so in alchemy in such an obscure and complicated way was due, essentially, to the great psychological difficulties in antinomian thinking, which continually came up against the demand for the logical consistency of the metaphysical figures and of their emotional absoluteness. The bonum super excedens of God allows no integration of evil. Although Nicholas Cusanus ventured the bold thought of the coincidentia oppositorium, its logical consequence, the relativity of the God concept, proved disastrous for Angelus Silesius, and only the withered laurels of the poet lie on his grave. He had drunk with Jacob Boehme at the fount of Mater Alchemica. The alchemists, too, became choked in their own confusions. Once again, therefore, it is the medical investigators of nature who, equipped with new means of knowledge, have rescued these tangled problems from projection by making them the proper subject of psychology. This could never have happened before for the simple reason that there was no psychology of the unconscious. But the medical investigator, thanks to his knowledge of the archetypal process, is in the fortunate position of being able to recognize in the abstruse and grotesque-looking symbolisms of alchemy the nearest relatives of those serial fantasies which underlie the delusions of paranoid schizophrenia, as well as the healing processes and work in the psychogenic neuroses. The overweening contempt which other departments of science have for the apparently negligible psychic process of pathological individuals should not deter the doctor in his task of helping and healing the sick. But he can help the sick psyche only when he meets it as the unique psyche of that particular individual, and when he knows its earthly and unearthly darknesses. He should also consider it just as important to defend the standpoint of consciousness, clarity, reason, and an acknowledged and proven good against the raging torrent that flows for all eternity in the darkness of the psyche. That leaves nothing unaltered and ceaselessly creates a past that can never be retrieved. He knows that there is nothing purely good in the realm of human experience, but also that for many people it is better to be convinced of an absolute good and to listen to the voice of those who espouse the superiority of consciousness and unambiguous thinking. He may solace himself with the thought that one who can join the shadow to the light is the possessor of the greater riches. But he will not fall into the temptation of playing the lawgiver, nor will he pretend to be a prophet of the truth, for he knows that the sick, suffering, or helpless patient standing before him is not the public, but is Mr. or Mrs. X, and that the doctor has to put something tangible and helpful on the table, or he is no doctor. His duty is always to the individual, and he is persuaded that nothing has happened if his individual has not been helped. He is answerable to the individual in the first place, and to society only in the second. If he therefore prefers individual treatment to collective ameliorations, this accords with the experience that social and collective influences usually produce only a mass intoxication, and that only man's action upon man can bring about a real transformation. Footnote 59. In psychotherapy, the situation is no different from what it is in somatic medicine, where surgery is performed on the individual. I mention this fact because of the modern tendency to treat the psyche by group analysis as if it were a collective phenomenon. The psyche as an individual factor is thereby eliminated. It cannot have escaped the alchemists that their soul had something to do with man. Thus, Dorn says, "From the beginning man was sulfur. Sulfur is a destructive fire enkindled by the invisible sun, and this sun is the soul philosophorum." 60. Well, that's a reference to a book, which is the much sought after and highly praised philosophic gold, and indeed the goal of the whole work. Footnote 61. Ripley, Chemistry Schriften. For then your work will obtain the perfect whiteness. Then turn from the east towards midday. There should rest at a fiery place, for that is the harvest or end of the work. Thereupon the sun will shine pure red in its circle, and will triumph after the darkness. In spite of the fact that Dorn regards the sun and its sulfur as a kind of physiological component of the human body, it is clear that we are dealing with a piece of physiological mythology. An example, a projection. In the course of our inquiry, we have often seen that despite a complete absence of any psychology, the alchemical projections sketch a picture of certain fundamental psychological facts and, as it were, reflect them in matter. One of these fundamental facts is the primary pair of opposites, consciousness and unconsciousness, whose symbols are soul and luna. We know well enough that the unconscious appears personified. Mostly, it is the anima. 62. Concerning the archetypes with special reference to the anima concept. An example of the anima in plural form is given in psychology and alchemy. Who in singular or plural form represents the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is personified by the shadow. Footnote 63. Concerning the archetypes with special reference to the Examples of both archetypes are to be found in Ibid, also in Ion. Another problem is the shadow of the self, which is not considered here. More rarely, the collective unconscious is personified as a wise old man. Footnote 64, Psychology and Alchemy. These are all the deviations from Freud. Freud was that it was the group, whereas Jung is the individual. Doing the shadow work is what we talk about all the time. It is what is described in this book. It is going back and finding the causality of your trauma and dealing with it. That is intrinsically you, yourself, not the club, not the group, not even the person involved, but you going back for you. I am speaking here only of masculine psychology, which alone can be compared with that of the alchemist. I am unfamiliar with feminine psychology. It is still rarer for Luna to represent the nocturnal side of the psyche in dreams. But in the products of active imagination, the symbol of the moon appears much more often, as also does the sun, which represents the luminous realm of our psyche and our diurnal consciousness. The modern unconscious has little use for sun and moon as dream symbols. Footnote 65. Examples of the sun and moon dreams are given in Ibid. Illumination, a light dawns, it is becoming clear, etc., can be expressed just as well or even better in modern dreams by switching on the electric light. It is therefore not surprising if the unconscious appears in projected and symbolized form, as there is no other way by which it might be perceived. But this is apparently not the case with consciousness. Consciousness, as the essence of all conscious contents, seems to lack the basic requirements for a projection. Properly understood, projection is not a voluntary happening. It is something that approaches the conscious mind from outside, a kind of sheen on the object, while all the time the subject remains unaware that he himself is the source of the light which causes the cat's eye of the projection to shine. This is, right, you see reflected in someone else the thing that you hate about yourself, right? Whenever you get aggravated with somebody for an action, there is a very good possibility that it is an action that you take. That it is even an action that you take that you are not happy with taking. That is what this is talking about. The projection is, I call you evil because you hold viewpoints that are different than mine, right? But maybe my viewpoint is the one that has actually contained the evil elements. You are merely a reflection of what I want to see, not reflected back at me. And that's not quite the right way to phrase that, but it's projecting upon someone else the things that are actually part of you, right? That is something that we see constantly, right? All of these Antifa people, they are not anti-fascist. They are instead actually fascist, right? But they are projecting upon their opponents the title of fascist, even though there is no real reason to do so. They are projecting their own actions upon the actions of others and taking the worst possible correlation from that, casting the shine. Luna is therefore conceivable as a projection, but soul as a projection, since it symbolizes consciousness, seems at first glance a contradiction in terms, yet soul is no less a projection than Luna. For just as we perceive nothing of the real sun but light and heat, and apart from that can know its physical constitution only by inference, so our consciousness issues from a dark body, the ego, which is indispensable condition for all consciousness, the latter being nothing but the association of an object or a content with the ego. The ego, ostensibly the thing we know most about, is in fact a highly complex affair full of unfathomable obscurities. Indeed, one could even define it as relatively constant personification of the unconscious itself, or as the Schopenhauerian mirror, in which the unconscious becomes aware of its own face. 66. Here the concept of the self can be mentioned only in passing. For a detailed discussion, see Ion. The self is the hypothetical summation of an indescribable totality, one half of which is constituted by ego consciousness, the other by the shadow. The latter, so far as it can be established empirically, usually presents itself as the inferior or negative personality. It comprises that part of the collective unconscious which intrudes into the personal sphere, there forming the so-called personal unconscious. The shadow forms, as it were, a bridge to the figure of the anima, who is only partly personal, and through her to the impersonal figures of the collective unconscious. The concept of the self is essentially intuitive and embraces ego consciousness, shadow, anima, and collective unconscious in an indeterminable extension. As a totality, the self is coincidentia, oppositorium. It is therefore bright and dark, and yet neither. If we hypostasize the self and derive it from it, as from a kind of pre-existent personality, the ego and the shadow, then these would appear as the empirical aspects of the opposites that are preformed in the self. Since I have no wish to construct a world of speculative concepts, which leads merely to the barren hair-splitting of philosophical discussion, I set no particular store by these reflections. If such concepts provisionally serve to put the empirical matter in order, they will have fulfilled their purpose. The empiricist has nothing to say about the concepts, self and God in themselves, and how they are related to one another. All the worlds that have ever existed before man were physically there, but they were a nameless happening, not a definite actuality, for there did not yet exist that minimal concentration of the psychic factor, which was also present, so to speak, the Word that outweighed the whole of creation. That is the world, and this is I. That was the first morning of the world, the first sunrise after the primal darkness, when that incoherently conscious complex, the ego, the son of the darkness, knowingly sundered subject and object, and thus precipitated the world and itself into definite existence. Footnote 67. Genesis 1:1-7 is a projection of this process. The coming of consciousness is described as an objective event, the active subject of which is not the ego, but Elohim. Since primitive people very often do not feel themselves the subject of their thinking, it is possible that in the distant past consciousness appeared as an outside event that happened to the ego, and that it was integrated with the subject only in latter times. Illumination and inspiration, which in reality are sudden expansions of consciousness, still seem to have, even for us, a subject that is not the ego. Newman, The Origins and History of Consciousness. Giving it and itself a voice and a name. The refulgent body of the sun is the ego and its field of consciousness, light without and darkness within. It is the source of light. In the source of light, there is darkness enough for any amount of projections, for the ego grows out of the darkness of the psyche. In view of the supreme importance of the ego in bringing reality to light, we can understand why this infinitesimal speck in the universe was personified as the sun, with all the attributes that this image implies. As the medieval mind was incomparably more alive than ours to the divine quality of the sun, we may assume that the totality character of the sun image was implicit in all its allegorical or symbolic applications. Among the significations of the sun as totality, the most important was its frequent use as a god image, not only in pagan times, but in the sphere of Christianity as well. Although the alchemists came very close to realizing that the ego was mysteriously elusive arcane substance and the longed-for lapis, they were not aware that with their sun symbology they were establishing an intimate connection between God and the ego. As already remarked, projection is not a voluntary act. It is a natural phenomenon beyond the interference of the conscious mind and peculiar to the nature of the human psyche. If, therefore, it is this nature that produces the sun symbol, nature herself is expressing an identity of God and ego. In that case, only unconscious nature can be accused of blasphemy. but not the man who is its victim. It is the rooted conviction of the West that God and the ego are worlds apart. In India, on the other hand, their identity was taken as self-evident. It was the nature of the Indian mind to become aware of the world-creating significance of the consciousness manifested in man. 68 and 69. 68. I use the word consciousness here as the equivalent to ego, since in my view they are aspects of the same phenomenon. Surely there can be no consciousness without a knowing subject, and vice versa. The ego is the part that makes the decisions. Right? That would be consciousness. 69. The Rig Veda, and this prayer of the Singha, continually expanding, became a cow that was there before the world was, the gods are foster children of the same brood, dwelling together in the womb of this god. Vajrasanya Samhita 34.3. He who has consciousness, thought, decision, dwells as immortal light within man. Why is the footnote continuing? The West, on the contrary, has always emphasized the littleness, weakness, and sinfulness of the ego, despite the fact that it elevated one man to the status of divinity. The alchemist at least suspected man's hidden godlikeness, and the intuition of the Angelus Silesius finally expressed it without disguise. The East resolves these confusing and contradictory aspects by merging the ego, the personal Atman, with the universal Atman, and thus explaining the ego as the veil of Maya. That is not far removed from what I say, right? The soul, being the individualized piece of God, would be the personal Atman and the universal Atman. The veil of Maya is the illusion of reality which I do not necessarily comport with. However, the Western alchemist was not consciously aware of these problems, but when his unspoken assumptions and his symbols reached the plane of conscious gnosis, as was the case with Angelus Silesius, it was precisely the littleness and lowness of the ego that impelled him to recognize its identity with its extreme opposite. 70 and 71. 70. Save as a child, one goes not in where all God's children are, the door is much too small. 71. I am God's child and son, and he is mine. How comes it that we both combine? God is my center when I close him in, and my circumference when I melt in him. God, infinite, more present is in me than is if a sponge should soak up all the sea. The hen contains the egg the hen, the twain in one, and yet the one in twain. God becomes I and takes my manhood on, because I was before him, was that done. Again, that does not disagree with what I say. We are here for the experience. This is describing the experience, right? This is describing the oneness. God is my center when I close him in. When I see God, I find him within me. And my circumference when I melt in him, right? The first one, God is my center, is prayer. Circumference is going to be meditation. You melt into God. God, infinite, more present, is in me. Yes, I agree. It was not the arbitrary opinions of deranged minds that gave rise to such insights, but rather the nature of the psyche itself, which, in the East and West alike, expresses these truths either directly or clothed in transparent metaphors. This is understandable when we realize that a world-creating quality attaches to human consciousness as such. In saying this, we violate no religious convictions, for the religious believer is at liberty to regard man's consciousness, through which, as it were, a second world creation was enacted, as a divine instrument. I must point out to the reader that these remarks on the significance of the ego might easily prompt him to charge me with grossly contradicting myself. He will perhaps remember that he has come across a very similar argument in my other writings, only there it was not a question of ego, but of the self, or rather the personal Atman in contradistinction and in relation to the suprapersonal Atman. I have defined the self as the totality of the conscious and the unconscious psyche, and the ego as the central reference point of consciousness. It is an essential part of the self and can be used pars pro toto when the significance of consciousness is born in the mind. But when we want to lay emphasis on the psychic totality, it is better to use the term self. There is no question of a contradictory definition, but merely of a difference of standpoint. And that is going to bring us to the end of the sun. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult series of topics. I understand I have some unconventional beliefs. I also have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. The self-assumption, the self-insertion of the Christian into this is not a necessity at all. In fact, it rather muddies the waters intentionally. The control system that is Christianity was created to control you. It was to put barriers on your behavior. That is control. No control put up by an outside source upon you is ever going to be the correct control. The only control that is actually correct is the control that you receive through self-reflection, by doing the shadow work and by working on yourself to become better. Those are the only guardrails that actually make a difference. Now, you can use the control systems to begin your journey. You can even ride those control systems with little detriment all the way to the end. Right? I do not hold necessarily that these control systems are intrinsically evil, but they do restrict you from the power that God created you with. The explanations as given by the alchemist, those make sense. The ones given by the Christians, they don't. The direct contradiction of the New Testament with the Old Testament is a very significant problem that is apologized for by a lot of people, but I will not be one of those people. The contradictions contained within the Old Testament with itself, quite often within the same chapter, within the same book of itself, is also one of those problems which I will not apologize for. The entire book is fundamentally flawed as a literal reference to anything. It can be taken as an allegory, but even then, it's not a good one. That's where I'm going to wrap this one up. Hopefully, I did that already. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that was said, put it in the box down below, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of my book where I teach you to do magic and live life responsibly, or consulting me directly through Connect. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.